Good morning and welcome to Porch Stories. Today we'll hear from Greg Gwaltney, a longtime resident of Venice Beach, Maryland. Greg developed a love of water early in life. He spent his summers here with his family, learning all about living by the water. Today he will share some of his memories with us. So Greg, welcome to Porch Stories.
Thank you.
When did your family first begin to visit Venice Beach, and what attracted them to the area?
Uh, I believe they started coming down here in the early 20s, probably around 1921 or so. I think they had friends here, the Wilders and the Leak family, and some others that probably introduced them to the area. And how could you not fall in love with the water and the community down here? It's just something that they were drawn to. My grandfather was a teacher. They were all educators in Washington, D.C. And I think they thought it was a great place to bring their kids. By the time they bought here in 1931, they bought this property. My mother would have been 10 years old, and my aunt Rita would have been about 3. So I'm sure they were looking at this as a little summer getaway as well.
Can you describe your family home, what it was like then?
When my grandfather bought it, it was nothing but a little farmhouse. Back in 1931, he added on a front porch to it. He added a side porch. He put a kitchen on the back, and then another little area and another bathroom. And eventually, I think in about 1967, he built another addition because there were 12 of us then. It was my grandparents. It was my parents, Woodrow Gwaltney and Barbara Buckner Gwaltney, and my brother Bill and myself. But then it was also during the summer, my cousins and aunt and uncle would come down. So Aunt Rita, Uncle Warren, and then it was Stanley, Teresa, Michael, and Charlie. So on any given weekend, there might be 12 of us here, and all the rooms were filled.
Now, Greg, living by the water is an education in and of itself. So what experiences contributed to your love of water?
I had a double dose of the love of the water. I experienced it on both sides of my family. I'll talk a little bit about my father's side because on my father's side, we had and still have African-American watermen from Smithfield, Virginia. And they still are oystering and crabbing and pulling up shad nets and taking fishing parties out in large boats. I learned a little bit from down there. And then here, my grandfather actually built 2 of the rowboats that we had. And at a certain age, he would release us. He would say, you can take the boats out. He showed us how to row the rowboats. And as we got older, put on your life preserver and so forth. We would go down to the end of the creek down here in Oyster Creek, and we looked for bubbles. I don't know how we figured that out, but we looked for bubbles, and we would dig up the soft-shell crabs that had shed their outer skin. They were molting. They had backed into the sand, and we would bring them back, and my grandmother would dress them and cook them, and that's what we had for breakfast. So, it was that love of the water as well. But then when my grandfather actually put some of the old outboard motors on the back of the boat, that was total freedom. That was like getting a car for us at, maybe age 10 or 11. And he trusted us, told us where to go, where not to go. We probably went a little past where he told us not to go, but we would go out and we would go fishing and crabbing and just, I think we thought that we were just like the boys in the show Flipper, because we would just get in the boat and just go. It was a whole, like I said, a whole new freedom for us. So, but one of the other things too, I was able to go to summer camp at Camp Letts, and that's where I learned how to sail and kind of show off my rowboat skills and canoeing and so forth. But it was a lot of fun, but a lot of learning, also water related.
Well, now, after a while, I think you made this your permanent residence. And so, how did that happen, and how do you enjoy living here now?
Well, when my grandfather passed away, we there was a piece of property in D.C. that I ended up getting, and my brother ended up getting this piece of property where we are now. And he, I think, had planned on building here, but he moved out west to Denver, and he said he was not going to be coming back. And so I told him, hold on, don't sell this property to anybody yet. I'd like to buy it from you. So I bought it from him, I believe, in 1994. And just would kind of cut the grass and, make sure everything was okay. And then I sold the other house, and I bought this property because it was so near and dear to my heart. So it took me about 14 years before I built. I built this house in 2008, and have been here ever since. And married a Highland Beach girl. I just love it here, and she spent her summers here too. So it was sort of a match made in heaven.
This property, you did maintain or keep some of the older structure, which is your grandfather, you said?
Yeah, actually, the property line is right here. My grandparents owned all of the property from that fence line over, including that garage. My cousin, Michael Sly, actually owns that property, but he kept that garage up. And that's the garage that my grandfather taught us how to use many of the tools. My grandfather helped keep the architecture program, and believe it or not, in 1918, he helped keep the architecture program alive at Howard University. It was starting to kind of wane out a little bit, and he was teaching woodworking and art and drawing and so forth. And actually, he was called to serve in the First World War, but he remained in Washington, D.C., and he was teaching soldiers carpentry skills. So then he went back to Howard when the war ended, which was rather short when he came in the First World War. And then he taught at Armstrong as a arts and craft and art teacher. And then he ended up becoming appointed. He was principal of Phelps, and then Armstrong again as principal. But he had all of these skills, and he would show us, it might be a rainy day, and he'd take us out to the garage, and this is how you do that. Start your saw like this, and don't, he would kind of break it down, but he was so patient. I wish I had his patience. But he was so patient with us, and a lot of those skills I still use today. This would be a typical day spent with my grandparents at the DC house. I would go over, my grandmother would watch her TV shows during the day, and I think my grandfather saw that we were getting a little, kind of, oh my God, we're watching TV with grandma kind of thing. And he's like, come on, let's go. And we'd go to Sears, he'd buy a tool, we'd go to one of the houses maybe and repair some back steps. And then he would take us to, like some of the Smithsonian's and some of the art galleries, which, I found amazing. It was just great, and it was great exposure to.
Well, now you mentioned art, and I think you had some members of your family who were artists. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, my grandfather, like I mentioned before, taught art. He always drew. I used to remember him on the front porch, and he would have an easel up, and he would paint different houses. He painted one of Dr. Cobb's little summer house. It's been taken down now, but and some scenes of Oyster Harbor. My mother painted, and she was in this group called the Little Paris Group in D.C., which I never knew was kind of a thing. But I didn't find out until later when I had some friends who were artists that said, hey, I saw your mother, and actually Mrs. Williamson, who used to live here as well, was also in the same picture. with this little Paris group.
So, Greg, tell us about some of the neighbors that you grew up with around here. Some of the older people that maybe helped to mold you as a young man.
Yeah, like I said, it really was a community, and it was some great people. I thought growing up, and these were older people that I looked up to. But I can kind of go down the street and kind of come back around, and the folks that were there then. It was Hortense Fitzgerald and her husband. It was the Cliffords that lived across the street, and Rosemary Wilson, Rosemary Clifford Wilson, was one of my mom's best friends, and I have some pictures of them. They were always hanging out, or they would row the boats back when they were kids and so forth. Dr. Montague Cobb, who was very famous for a lot of different reasons, but Dr. Montague Cobb and his wife Hilda lived across the street, and they had one of the only, back in the day, I guess I'm telling my age a little bit, there weren't that many telephones down here. We had one, the Cobbs had one, and I believe there were a couple other houses. But when they would ring, you could hear them ring. They were so loud. But so the Cobbs, then kind of going down the street, it was C.K. Brown, who was an attorney in D.C., and his wife, Edwina. Then it was the Holmes family. I think there was a Dr. Brown, who was a educator from Baltimore, who owned the house that Mr. Tibbs ended up buying and fixing up. Then it was the Wilder family. We were very close with the Wilders. Then it was the Williamsons, where Maurice Clifford lives now. Then it was the Tymus family. I think they were from Baltimore, next to them. Then it was the Leake family, so Mrs. Leake, and she was a sister of Mrs. Wilder. And then the Simpkins, that was the next house down. Then you kind of come over on the other side of the street and come back up. It was Dr. Foster. And then it was one of my favorite ladies who lived here was Mrs. Annie Duncan. And she lived right on Westover Lane. And I used to, when I first started cutting grass, I would cut her grass. And she would give me $20, which then that was probably like $150 now. As a kid, but $20, and she would give you a pound cake. And to this day, that was probably the best pound cake I ever had. And then, kind of coming back up the street, I didn't know some of the other families, but I knew O'Neill Hannon, and then it was the Welsh sisters. And the Welsh sisters had a house, and I would cut their grass too sometimes. And then there was Mrs. Moses. And next to them were Charlene Drew Jarvis's now were the Gillum family. So Bert and Maria Gillum were the kids there, so I knew them. And then it was us. And then next door over here were the Stinsons. And I'm not sure, I don't know if they were from Baltimore or not, but Sandy and Alan were the older kids. They were like Maurice and, or what we used to call Buddy and Jay. They were probably a little older than Buddy and Jay, and we all looked up to them because they were the cool older kids, and they had boats and access and stuff like that. They were us before we were us.
Right.
And then next to them was the Weir family. It was the Weirs, and all of their relatives would come down. So it was the Butcher family, and then the Harris and Johnsons were the daughters and their husbands. Family names came down. And then it was Mr. Jennifer on the corner. I'll tell you a quick story about Mr. Jennifer. He used to run the Baltimore, or he had some part in dealing with the Baltimore Civic Center, and he had asked some of us, some of the parents back probably 1972, I guess, if we wanted to come up and see the Jackson 5. So one of the parents took us up, and we got to go backstage with the Jackson 5, which was that was pretty cool. Many great stories about all of those folks, but they were all, like I said, a community, and my grandparents really got along with most of the folks down here. Everybody did. And I think growing up, I saw that and really revered a lot of these folks, and didn't really even know the importance of some of these people then. But like I said, Dr. Montague Cobb, has a little exhibit at the African American Museum just for some of the work he did, and he ended up being the physician that actually did the physiological study on Jesse Owens after the Germans said that African Americans were built more like animals than human beings.
Well, Greg, this has been most enlightening. Your roots run deep along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, and I want to thank you for sharing your memories with us today. I'm sure everyone will enjoy it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being part of the Porch Story tradition now.
Thank you.